There we go. I'm going to be talking about designing beautiful APIs. And something that's pretty crazy is that this session actually resulted in a new book deal from Manning, and also a new PowerShell module called Fine Tuna. I'll tell y'all all about the book later, in a later slide, but I'm really excited. This right here, this really beautiful flower was made with Midjourney, and I have to warn you that I am super obsessed with AI right now. So the whole thing, like, I just never thought that it would apply to me. I always saw, like Steflock and other people that were really involved in AI, and it didn't really click with me until GPT-4. So anyway, I'm going to talk a lot about it. In this session, I do want to accomplish two things, right? The first thing is to show you just the value of APIs in general and the beauty, both on like the web structure part, but also on the PowerShell part. And I also want to, for people who are kind of scared or hesitant about Azure PowerShell functions, like I was for so long, I want to break it down in a way that you understand, and hopefully get past that. Because for so long, I was mentioning earlier that, like Jess and Beardy and Brett and Barbara, they were all talking about PowerShell Azure functions, and it never really clicked until I had to use them, and then ended up making this an API, and from that, learning the best practices that I'll be sharing here. So my name is Chrissy LeMaire, and I am a dual Microsoft MVP and GitHub star. I'm also starting tomorrow, moving back to Belgium. I love Belgium. It feels like home. I'm really excited. I'm going to be a software engineer. I do have a diverse skill set. I've been doing the web since like the late 90s. And so yeah, I'm going back to Belgium to do some web stuff, working with good old SharePoint. I'm also a Manning author. I think we got all three of my co-authors in this room now. We wrote Learn DBA Tools in a month of lunches. This is an evergreen 50% off. So if you ever want to buy it or share it with a friend, it'll totally work. So I'm no longer on Twitter, but I am on Blue Sky. I really like how you can set up your own domains, and these are my usernames. And today we're going to be talking about beautiful APIs. I really love working with them. And so I asked ChatGPT whenever I was like using it to help research for this, I was like, what exactly makes a beautiful API? And I love what it said. It said that there's a bunch of things, and then it said, beyond the technical details, a beautiful API brings developers a sense of joy and accomplishment as they work with it. And that is totally my experience as well. So what are the things specifically that bring joy and accomplishment? The first one is a low barrier to entry. So it has to be pretty straightforward and easy to use. And the second thing is sensible defaults. And I see a lot of parallels with, let me set this to do not disturb. My apologies. Do not disturb. That's not going to work. Okay. Damn. Let's see. There we go. All right. So I see a lot of parallels with PowerShell in that, like, for me, I think that a successful module won't require a bunch of things for you to, when you're executing it, like parameter after parameter after parameter, just give the users some sensible defaults and make some decisions for them. Also, it has to have an intuitive design. So there has to be consistency and predictability. And that's, I think, what I love most about it. Like, I'm like, all right, well, if I go to /albums, is that going to work? And then it does. And it's like, it's a super delight. Also, Documentation and examples, and this is another parallel that I see with PowerShell, but even more so within API building. I think that documentation is an essential part of their entire community. And anytime that I'm using an API, I really love, like I was actually just working with OpenAI's documentation, and it's just so nice that it's there and available, and it's almost like a guaranteed thing. Also, informative errors can be very helpful to a user. Of course, you want to enable your developers to be able to take action and say, here's the problem, and also here's possibly the solution. And finally, batch operations. For me, as a SQL Server DBA, I love to do just like tons of rows all at once. And it's always a delight for me whenever I'm like, oh, do I have to do this? Is this going to be slow? And then I see that it's just one CSV file, and then it'll process it there in the background. So we'll look at some beloved APIs, and if you Google beloved APIs, Stripe always comes up, and Twilio as well. I haven't used those. Also S3, which is kind of the standard. I haven't used those, but I am a huge fan of Spotify, of GitHub's API, and also Tenable. So I was doing some blue teaming, like cybersecurity stuff, and it was so manual, loading up a web page and adding things that way. And with their API, I was actually able to create a PowerShell module that just did combo kills and did deployments, of course, all with one command, and the API enabled that. So why build an API? I was actually asked that when I was working on a project where I had proposed it as a potential solution. And they were like, I don't really understand. I'm working more with a web mindset. Can you tell me why? And I'll explain to you with a story. Like back in the late 90s, I actually created a website for my favorite folk singer. Her name is Ani DeFranco, and the website was really engaging, and everybody, they were using it, and her record company actually took notice and said, hey, can you please make our e-commerce website? And I was like, hell yeah. How cool was that? I got to meet like my favorite person ever at the time. So we built out an e-commerce site. I was super proud of all my relational database stuff. And then we hooked it up into the Righteous Babe Records website. So we had this database, and there's just one thing, right? That's exposing this database to the web. This is the old way. That's where it ended. If you wanted to interact with that database, you're going to have to go to the website. But nowadays, what you want to do is take that database, expose it through an API. You can use it for the web, but you can also use it. Man, I don't know why this isn't working. My apologies. Hey, Lou? Nope, she's not. All right. So you can also, hold on, give me a second. Lou, can you please tell Brandon to stop messaging because I can't get it to turn off? My apologies. I know that I just yelled. So you have this database, and if you expose it through the API, then you can expose it through things like Salesforce and Teams and Stripe and Power Apps and Power BI. So it just brings in so much more functionality. Instead of being this isolated little thing, APIs can really enable everyone to engage with all of, like if you're an MSP, you can have your partners get into your database through your well-documented API. And it's cool. Like it's not just your SQL Server databases, right? You can expose things like Splunk and WordPress and Azure Active Directory or Entra ID all through your API. So it becomes this really holistic solution. So why else build an API? We've already talked about custom apps and third-party integration. Another reason that I really love is that it gives you the opportunity when you're using Azure Functions for astounding scale for running PowerShell commands. So I reached out to Brett Miller and I said, hey, Brett, what are you using an API for? Like I was really having a hard time understanding. And he said, if you've ever needed to execute a whole bunch of PowerShell commands instead of doing it synchronously, if you use the API, then you can scale that. You can take one command and execute it 10,000 times or 20,000 for like 20,000 databases. And that's whenever I realized all of the possibilities. Previously, whenever I would import a bunch of data, I would like open up 9 different PowerShell.exes. This is just a way better way to do it. Next, it's firewall-friendly. So as a SQL Server DBA, we have like port 1433. That's always a problem. But what's awesome about APIs is that generally everything is done over port 443. And that's generally open both in and out, if it's set up. Also, I really like this. So if you build an API, you also create a community and you allow external developers to bring more functionality to your product. And a great example of that is actually SQL Server. They built an API using SMO, and then we as the DBA Tools community and the DBA Checks community came in and extended the functionality that existed. So now that I've convinced you to use an API, hopefully, we're going to talk about doing it with your current PowerShell skill set using Azure PowerShell Functions. So what is it? So they call it like this serverless compute service, which I don't exactly, I kind of get it. It seems like there's a server there probably, but what I really like about serverless compute service is that if I learn Azure PowerShell Functions, I can put that on my resume. Also, like we had talked about earlier, it's essentially, if you think of it like PowerShell commands, but in the cloud. And these PowerShell commands, they respond to events like HTTP requests, which is an API, database operations. We see Azure SQL is doing a lot with APIs and things like timers so you can do scheduled tasks. Also, they support long-running tasks too, right? So it's not just, execute the command and then it's over. It supports this through something called durable functions, and it won't be covered in this presentation, but it is available if you're interested in it. So when you're building a PowerShell, an Azure Function app, you can use PowerShell, but you can also use C# or JavaScript, Python, whatever you're familiar with. And for the most part, I developed mine in PowerShell. And there was this guy from Belgium, Cohen, I think it was him. He had said he generally uses PowerShell because it's quick to develop. But if he has to insert like, billion rows or something, then he'll generally switch to C#. But for the most part, I have found that that PowerShell works entirely for me. So let's talk about some of the key components of the Azure PowerShell functions. And what I want to do is relate it to terminology that you're familiar with. And that's PowerShell terminology. So for the Functions app, whenever you create an Azure PowerShell function, you're first going to create an app. And you can think of this as the PowerShell module. So this app is going to hold all of your functions. Your functions is like a PowerShell command, and this is the actual code that you'll be executing. The third and final component is triggers and bindings, and these are similar to parameters and results. So think of it as inputs and outputs. So whenever I created it, I remember I came to this website and I was like, so I went, I clicked around and I was like, create, and it was still this kind of felt blind to it. It was this thing in the cloud that I didn't really get. But it turns out that really what it does, and this is very common in the Linux world, it relies a lot on the file system, right? So when you have an Azure Function app, this is one of their examples from Microsoft. So it shows, the first, you have your PS app and then the functions under there. But whenever I looked at this, I was like, all right, PS Function app, what is my first function? What exactly is that? And what I kind of came up with to explain it better, because I like really solid examples. So this is a GitHub repo that I could have made for the Righteous Babe Records API. And we have like .github, which is going to have your workflows, which can publish your Azure functions. And then for me, like I actually ended up creating it. In the old days, I used to save all of my PowerShell functions in a folder called Functions. Now I do it public and private. But for this, I still thought this is the most sensible way for me. I create a folder named Functions, and then under that, I have your albums, artists, songs. You can also include modules. So there's a way that you can require a module and it'll go out to the PowerShell gallery, but you can also save them locally, and that is available in there as well. Then you have your other commands that are basically like if you're familiar with web development, you'll have, your web.config, that's the host.json, etc. So let's talk about it specifically in more PowerShell equivalents. If you have an Azure Function app, that's going to be the module. If you have your Azure Function, that's going to be the commandlet. And then you have your host.json. And what's really cool about this particular slide, the thing that really opened my eyes to AI, I was writing to ChatGPT and I said, all right, I'm trying to convey something to a PowerShell audience. And I'm thinking Azure Function app is a module, Azure Function is a commandlet. Can you tell me what the rest are? And I was like, yeah, I totally get what you're saying. And then it gave me this. And I was like, yes, it's true. The closest thing is it's a module manifest for the host.json. And the requirements is like the required modules in your PSD1. It also, awesomely enough, has a profile.ps1, which is similar to the profile that you're used to. Your local settings is like your environmental variables and function JSON. So each of those directories that we saw earlier, you had albums, you had artists, you need two files in there. One is the function.json, and that's like the parameter binding for commandlets. And then you have your run.ps1, which is actually the code that you'll be executing. And if you are a web developer like I am now, this is kind of what I'm guessing is that like the function app is IIS, that is the web server. And then you have your web pages, like I'd mentioned earlier, your web config, you have your NuGet packages.config, and so on. So this kind of helped me bring it from this kind of like mystery cloud thing to thinking of it in terms that I was familiar with. And I was like, oh God, I get it. It made it just so much easier for me. So now that, like, I'm going to talk about the beautiful parts, right? And whenever you have the beautiful parts, I'm talking about two different things. The first one is the API itself and the way that it is laid out with its IDs and things like that. And then the second part is for you as the PowerShell developer is how to make it beautiful, like to enjoy writing the PowerShell within it. So whenever you're developing this API, you have your resource, and you've probably seen this before. You've probably worked with APIs before. You have your version and then your artist. This is called a resource. You kind of think it through. And the reason that I put this here is because when I was first starting out with Azure PowerShell functions and I wanted to build an API, I was like, how am I naming my folders? How am I naming my actual URLs? And a lot of the community has made APIs that it'll say like get VM, right? So they chose to include the verb as well as the noun. And what I ended up doing, and it took probably about 3 weeks for me to say, wait, I've worked with APIs before. I've done this. And I came across, there's a guy, David, he is awesome. I forgot his last name. I have it in my notes, but he does all of this API stuff and he did it a different way. Instead of including the verb in the URL, he actually uses it within the code, which is something that I'll be showing you. So I also wanted to look at best practices, and I had to look at the greater API best practices, and I found this. The first thing is that you're going to want to use nouns. So you don't want to use something like get artist. You just want to have your artists. And unlike PowerShell, you actually want to use plurals. So you have your artists plurals, and then a lot of people, they use the versioning. And I think that this is something that I am going to choose to do, but there's a new way to do it where people are actually giving the path inside of the JSON configuration. So whenever you make your request and it brings back JSON, you use that to interact with the API. And then that way you don't have to rely on V1, V2, etc. I haven't really decided, but I think for now I'm going to stick with the V1 just because it's more straightforward. So you want to use versioning. And you also want to avoid deep nesting. And this is something that for me as like a DBA, I was working on my URL. So I had like playlist and then playlist ID and then songs, but then I could have had the writer, right? I could have had the track listing or the album that it was a part of. And so I was getting very deeply nested with a very long URL. And then I thought about it, and it really wouldn't be enjoyable to use as an end user of my API. And then I found that, I was actually going against best practices, and that made sense. So the other thing that I thought was really cool is that, so for me, again, as a DBA, I am going to imagine whenever I'm working on my API, I'll just set an identity in my database, and the database server is going to generate that ID, and then I have to get it, and then I'll use it, right? But what I have found is that what you should do is generate the ID in the API, and then you don't have to do as many rounds. And it saves on time and network traffic. So we talked about the ID, and you're probably wondering, well, what do you use for an ID? I thought the same. I had ended up deciding on GUIDs, but it it wasn't enjoyable. It wasn't pretty. And I was like, how do other people do it? And it turns out that there's like so many different ways to do it. My favorite way is probably Spotify's base 62. And that's just because like it's short, it looks like a password. It's not very long. And probably the second one I would have to say is an int. But what I learned from this is that pretty much no matter what you choose to use as your ID, you can find some big old API that is doing the same. So you just really weigh out the pros and cons, and you'll probably not be wrong. So let's talk about the verb usage. So remember before we were talking about how you just want v1/artist instead of get. With HTTP methods, you have something called CRUD, which is create, read, update, and delete. Those are the things that are in databases, and they're similar in APIs as well. So you have, instead of, the CRUD, you have a get, which will get your resource, a post, which creates a new one. It's kind of like the new verb in PowerShell. You also have put and patch, which I haven't really ever used patch. I ended up going with put, and then of course delete. And then you have this word, and I'm terrible at saying it. I don't know. So, but basically what I think of it as is there's like kind of safe and less safe, right? So if it says yes in this list, then it's pretty safe. If you hit it multiple times, then it is going to stay the same. It's no big deal. But if it says no, like the post, like the create, if you hit that URL and you hit and with a post, it's going to create new records. So that's kind of more scary. And that's the way that I look at it. And finally, with APIs, we talked about earlier how like documentation is a huge deal. And what's really cool is that there are a lot of tools that are available to auto document. And they have like the Azure Functions extension, Postman, APIM is probably called APIM. That was the one that I was going to use. And then I ended up just abandoning my API project. But that was the one that I liked the most. and then there's also Function Monkey. The reason that I like the Azure API Management is because most of my friends were using them, and there were tons of documentation, and I'm already there. I'm already in Azure. So that was the one that I was going to go with, but I don't have that available in the demo today because I have not done that just yet. So now we're going to jump into the demo. Do we have any questions so far? Well, I take a sip of water. All right. So now let's go ahead and look at this API that I created. That's my cat Potato. So here we had talked before about the file system, right? If you remember, I had like a .git and then I had functions. This is what my API demo looks like. And if you go to github.com/potato quality/API-demo, you can find all of this here. It actually works. You could spin up a code space and actually run your Azure Functions, which is mind-boggling to me. And that's all thanks to the dev container. So in the first one, we have the dev container, and this actually has Docker containers that are specifically meant to, they were like built to support Azure Functions. And then within that, I actually have a script where I update these certificates. I install like PowerShell, LTS, etc. So what I love about this is that it's just PowerShell. So it's very familiar. And this is a dev container structure that I learned from other examples and that I use for every single one of my projects now. As a matter of fact, if you go to github.com/potato quality/dev containers, I wrote a big old blog post about my experience with dev containers. As I'd mentioned before, I was having problems like Azure Functions. I believe that it runs on something like Node.js locally. And I kept having versioning problems. And that's when I asked Jess Pomfret, I was like, what do you use? And she said, dev container. And then that week, Barbara Forbes was actually on a PowerShell podcast talking about dev containers. So I went and I cloned her repo and I started working with them immediately. And we'll see them working within this project momentarily. All right, then on GitHub, they have some workflows that are built into GitHub that allow you to publish your functions to Azure. I don't have any currently, but it is supported. I do want to show this VS Code because this is actually created whenever you first create a function app from scratch, and I'll just go through that real quick. Let's do that together. So we're going to create a new one. Come here. And with Azure. So if you remember earlier, I showed a screenshot of creating it on the web. You can also create it from the command line using Node. I do like this way the best. It's a visual way. So let's go ahead and see if we create a function app in Azure. So did I do this before? I don't know. Actually, I don't. Let's see. In Azure, create function, create new project. That's what I want to do because that's going to be local, right? So I want to create a new folder, and then I'll just say PSConf. I'm going to select that. So now for my new project, I'm going to say the language that I want to use to create this Azure Functions app. I want to run PowerShell in it, so we're going to choose that. And then if we had talked earlier about triggers and the one that we're going to use for APIs, you don't have to care about any of this except for maybe the durable functions in the future. But we're going to go with HTTP trigger. And then I want a good name. So let's say RBR API, or maybe just RBR. And for the authentication, not going to cover that here. I'll just pick anonymous, and then I want to open it in the current window. So now, awesome. So it created the .vs code right out the gate. And that's because it needs this setting.json that tells you where my apologies. It tells Azure Functions where your folder is that contains all of your functions. So right now, it'll just look locally, right? So we have a run.ps1 and a function.json under there. The place that I put it is actually in a folder called functions. And I just realized that I did this wrong. Just pretend that I named it functions. But I wanted to give you an idea of what is created right out the gate, because we're going to compare it to the more fully formed API app, or the Azure Functions app that I have for the demo. So I'm going to close this out. You see, there's just like a couple more things. All right, so now we have VS Code. If we look at it, we go to settings, that functions, that's what's important. The tasks, also important. Oh, I did want to highlight this. So Barbara's code, and actually all of the sample code, lists something, I think it's called so the type is PS functions. But I kept getting this OmniSharp error, and it took me probably a month to finally figure out, with the help of Stack Overflow, that if you put shell here, it just behaves a whole lot better. And so in the future, if I'm ever using Azure Functions, I'm just going to copy and paste the the tasks.json that I have here. All right, so we have our functions. I'm going to go over that in just a moment, but I do want to cover, you can do tests. I actually use Pester to test all of my functions whenever it goes into the commit, because how cool is that? It actually starts up a Docker container and then uses Pester against that Docker container to test all of my functions. Then we have the rest. None of this is really important. Let's go into the functions folder. So now you can see, whenever we talk about beauty, I feel like when you are working with the folder structure, it looks very similar to that of creating tables within a database. So this is, if there's any DBAs on the line, this should probably look familiar. This is something, I actually got this outline from Spotify. This is similar to what they use, and then I kind of expanded on it a bit. But we're gonna come back to that. So the first thing, it's very important. For this, you need to leave in this gitignore. I actually almost published my local.settings.json, which has a whole bunch of API keys. And what's really great about this gitignore is that it is not going to publish this, so you won't be exposing your keys. So keep that. And also the host.json we had talked about before, this one actually has quite a bit of stuff. And what I ended up doing is I went to somebody else's repo, it was Brett Miller's repo, and I just took one of his longest host.jsons because I figure at some point I would use that. So yeah, I just reused a smart guy's host.json. This route prefix, remember before, whenever we were talking about like /v1 artists, this is actually where you would put it. But because I want to show you a demo that's pretty, I'm just going to remove this for now. All right. So this one is do not show. This is actually just to remind me. This is what the local.settings.json actually looks like. And each of these turns into a PowerShell ENV, like an environmental variable. So you can reuse those. I'm going to skip local settings. Here's the profile. I love this profile because it's similar to whenever you just $ profile in your own PowerShell. This runs each time that the function app is started. So that's kind of like a PowerShell window being opened for the first time. And before I show you what's really cool about this, well, first, I love doing this in modules. Here, I'm able to turn confirm off for everything. So there's never a prompt because this isn't an interactive system. I also turn off enable exception, which is something that we do a lot in DBA tools. And I actually wrap in all of the examples before. Let me go and show you this example here, PSConf. So you can see here, like right out the gate, it gives you something to work with. So you have some parameters that you can get, right? And but this at the end, like, what is this? It's like, it's weird. There's this push output binding, and then you have to cast the hell out of everything. So you're making this HTTP response context. And I had to like copy and paste over and over and over again until I was like, wait. I couldn't remember any of this, right? Which is why I was copying and pasting. But what I did was in my profile, I actually just put push good request. So I don't have to remember any of that. And I set it up to where it's like nice. It handles a whole bunch of things for me. And it's easy to remember. So I really liked that. And we also have a bad request. So if if you're doing a throw, instead of doing a throw, you're going to push a bad request. And this is where you want to keep it informative for your end users. Okay, so something else that I did so that it would just kind of work and you could see, I have functions like get API item, and then I set the aliases and things like that. So this kind of gives you an idea of how you can set up your entire functions app for success by essentially putting in everything that you need in your profile. Now, the requirements, it'll be really interesting. I actually want to talk to Rob about this, and if Barbara is available as well. I asked both of them because they both chose different routes for the most part when they are working with and managing their required modules. So Barbara, in general, tends to use requirements.psd1, which actually goes out to the PowerShell gallery and gets the most recent update, or you can also version it as well. But Rob actually prefers to keep his modules and not use the PowerShell gallery. It goes down a bit. He also doesn't know if there's going to be breaking changes coming in. So he keeps his in a folder called modules. There's pros and cons. I have seen both of them used across the board. So whichever way you use will probably be successful. If you do use a requirements.psd1, it will take a little bit to get your modules going and your from this like cold start, because it has to go out to the PowerShell gallery and get it and then keep a local copy. So let's see, I set an outline here. So I'm going to show the overall repo, including VS Code and the settings, dive into functions, scroll down to the bottom. Yes, excellent. All right, so now we are going to talk about routes. And here we can see that, so whenever you have a big company with a big API, they can afford something called API Gateway. And the API Gateway it's a pretty expensive solution, but it allows you to do these really awesome dynamic routes. So what's a route? Well, a route is /albums, right? And I felt pretty clever about this. So for me, I used the route, and this is probably just the way it's supposed to be done anyway. I used the route, if you have album/1, right? That's the ID. You could do alpha. You can do a whole bunch of different types of data types that we'll look at. And then also options. So this just turns into $options, and then I can reuse it. I can make it a longer URL with like extra info. So it's just kind of like miscellaneous stuff at the end, and I handle that. And this is something that's really awesome. So I learned it from David, who is a PM. I talked about him earlier. He is a PM on the Azure SQL team. His methods. So before, again, we had people that were doing get VM, so it'd just be just the get method. And his was the first example that I saw in the Windows PowerShell C# world, where all of the methods are all in one function. And then what you do within your run is you support that, right? So check it out. So if you have this request.method, if it's a post, make a new item. If it's a patch, update it. If it's a delete, then remove it, etc. And I don't know if I have a get here. Maybe I did. And now we're going to talk about the actual routing. So in this case, actually, I don't like this, the meta. Let's go with tracks. I think that's more visual. So you have albums, and then you have tracks, and this is the track ID, but you cannot store a folder within your albums folder because you already have your functions .json and you already have your run.ps1 because it doesn't support subdirectories. So what you do is you make a directory with a little dash there, and then you can use the routing. This is kind of the this is if you don't have access to the API gateway, which I didn't because it was too expensive for the project that I was working on. So I did get kind of creative here. And I think that most of us are probably going to use this type of method. And again, it's something that you can come to the repo and get. So those are like the exciting things that I really like. This request here, if you're looking around at a bunch of Azure functions, you're going to see REQ. That's what the node people use, but we are PowerShellers, and so we have $request. And so that's where it gets the name from. These are actually variable names. Next up, I do want to show you. So we have these routes, and I think it's command. Nope. Oops. So it's actually control. So we have these, let me put it bigger real quick. We have the IDs, right? And a lot of people do int, ID int. I chose not to have an int. I wanted to have the base something, whatever it was that Spotify did. And so I set mine to be alpha, but this is where you get this list of all of the things that you can use in that little thing. And let me show you real quick that when we have, let's see, function.json, if you have this question mark, that means that it is optional. So you don't have to specify an ID. So this will support, if you do albums and tracks, then you can get all of the tracks and then filter it down from there. We already discussed the profile and the requirements. And then, yeah, David Mori is really like, I really like following him. So if you're super into APIs, that guy is really about best practices all the time. He's super creative. He has a lot of really awesome things. And what I'm going to end with is, so we have this outline that you can see, kind of looks like a database, but you probably want to see the API in action. And since this is a record company, we actually have a wrapping cat that was trained against OpenAI using the fine tuna PowerShell module. This is actually my cat Potato, and he's going to give a wrap. So let's go ahead and test this out. This is called fine tunings. I have a bunch of JSON-L files. I executed it against my OpenAI API, and then I created my own little AI, which is so cool. All right, let's go ahead and execute it. Oh, it's already running. Excellent. Oops. So the place that we look at it, whenever you're working with Azure Functions, we can come here. So it's running there, but also if we look at the ports, you also want to name your ports, and you do that in your VS Code directory. So let's go ahead and look at it. I see that we have 3 more minutes. That's perfect. All right, so this is Potato. You want to know something awesome? I love this. I actually drew this in Balsamic. I uploaded it to ChatGPT, and I said, hey, can you please make this wackadoo like 2007 make me laugh with this ridiculous webpage? So it not only made the web page, it also knows the context of what the web looked like whenever it was ridiculous in 2007. I did expect a few more drop shadows, but it's pretty good. We got this. We do have I guess there are 3 drop shadows there. So yeah, you can use OpenAPI with the Pro version that gives you the access to ChatGPT 4, and you upload a photo, you ask it to draw things out for you or to do your code, and it totally works. It's amazing. So that's what I used for this. And now we are going to ask Potato to wrap. It even said a web page, which cracked me up, right? I didn't change it from the default. It says a web page right here and a web page right there. All right, so now Potato, sing me a rap that is 4 verses long. I think that's how you spell verses. Let's talk to Potato. Let's see. So I was going to wrap, but then like, this doesn't really look like some good wrap. But anyway, this is actually what you'll see. You can do now. You can see that we have a web page, which is unusual. I did kind of hack it for this demo. We have a web page that shows this. And what I can also do is I can use invoke REST method URI HTTPS probably. I don't know. Is it HTTP? There we go. So I could do this and I could say bot. Then I would have to do the body and all of that. But to show you, this really demonstrates that you can access it via a web page or you can access it via the command line. And I put this out on the web. If you go to totbot.funbucket.de, this is the better one. That's actually really cool. So, hey, potato, make a rap about tuna. 4 verses long. Man, I feel like I'm spelling that wrong. Hey, tuna. I can't get enough. It's like cat crack. Whatever. So anyway, this is how you make an API using Azure PowerShell functions. I hope that it was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. And the floor is awesome. 45 minutes. The floor is open for questions, and I'll also be in the Chrissy LeMaire room once we're done. Oh my God, I just realized that the cat actually cusses, which is true. It does. But yeah, you can access that through PowerShell. Oh, you know what? I don't think that I'll feel very complete unless I go back and let me do it because I set it up so that's a lot easier. Invoke REST method. And I like my caps URI. There we go. Look, check it out. So we say, just body, how was lunch? And then it says, I couldn't eat it. It was canned tuna. And I don't know why, but I dislike it now. So I'll just keep asking him questions and he'll just keep answering. And then it talks about his mom. How freaking awesome is this? I totally love AI. And that's going to be probably my next session at PSConfEU in Belgium if my session is accepted. So again, thank you everyone for gathering with me today. And if you have any more questions, I am around. North of France, heck yeah. You know what? There's 2 places north of France, Germany, and also Belgium. So I never had to change my location. I was always north of France. All right. Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm glad that you liked it. Oh, hey, cool. Yeah, it was part of this was definitely inspired by the PowerShell podcast. Hearing Barbara talk about it was really cool, and I recommend it to everyone. And if anybody is here and hasn't checked out the PowerShell podcast, do so because it's awesome. I start like every week with it.